So, hi everyone. Hey, can you hear me in the back? Great. So, welcome to this talk. My name is Sabine Harrer, and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tampere in Finland, at something called the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies. A very long name. I identify as an experimental maker and scholar, and that basically means two things. First, I design games around personal experience, questions of how bodies might move in space, enjoy themselves, and how hardware can perhaps be used against the grain of the mainstream. And secondly, as a scholar, I use critical tools to investigate how games work, culturally, socially, economically. And one important question is the question of power. I'm investigating who gets to make games, who gets to, what versions of fun is the most credible version of fun we currently design for. And sometimes that can hurt. Because I really like looking at the creepy, nasty corners of social injustice sometimes, and but also under the ground where resistance and rethinking and transformation happens. So in short, I'm trying my best to contribute to a steadily growing counterculture of unruly games where I stand. So previously, in this conference, okay. Yes. Just to give you a little context, just a little recap of what I talked about when I was previously here in this conference, 2 years ago. And Adam is laughing already. So the first project I talked about back then is a game called Jokoi, and it's a video game my students and me made with 4 women who had experienced a pregnancy loss. So the game, but more importantly, the process of making it, was about finding a way to express grief and the complicated feelings around death of our loved ones. Since then, I've wrote a book about it, so ask your libraries to order it or come to me afterwards, and I'll tell you where I can download it for free. So yes. The second project I talked about last time was this. It's a game called Can't Touch This, which is a small vulva painting game which evoked all kinds of responses from the user base. So the process of making the game and observing responses had to tell us a lot about patterns of hope, shame, and fear around sexuality in the 21st century. But today I'll talk about something else, namely gardening. So I'll expand on a talk I gave earlier this year at the Amaze Festival in Berlin. Who knows the Amaze Festival? All right. It's an experimental festival that's hosted annually to give space for weird expressions. So I gave this talk as part of the Game Design as Gardening Summit, which basically means, yes, there was a whole series of talks dedicated to understanding game development through the lens of gardening. And I found it very fruitful to understand some of the mechanics of the games industry. So, yes, that's because gardens, like games, are systems, right? So, and as game devs, it might be really useful to check out other systems and how they have worked and learn from the features and flaws of these systems. So let me ask you a question. What is the first image that comes to your mind when you think of game design as gardening? Emergent play, yeah. Plucking out weeds and bugs. Interesting, cool. So, yes? I didn't catch that, sorry. Trying hard to keep things alive? Okay, cool. So my first image when I think about game design as gardening is something actually quite positive. Sowing the seeds and on hopefully fertile grounds, and then cultivate them until a game comes out that is hopefully interesting, right? Sometimes it's just a vague feeling of how to grow roots in an industry and become a successful game designer. So whatever it is, if your image is positive, hold on to it for a moment, because there might be some challenging stuff coming up soon. So one quick reminder, this talk is about systems. I want you to consider that. It's not about individuals. So it's about its dynamics, its forces, its structures. It's not individuals. I want you to remember that seeing parts of the system can be deeply unsettling at some time, not only for you, but also for me. But learning to face the facts and get unsettled is part of the deal. So as developers of entertainment products, it's healthy to register errors in a system. Only by facing failure can we build better systems, systems that become more accountable. As you might have noticed, I'm using humor in this talk. I'm a fan of silly puns, not sorry, which will hopefully produce a comforting level of collective cringiness, so brace yourselves, there's more coming up. But this is my way to keep our spirits up as we look at the dark sides of gardening, okay? So, because again, this dark side might inform us about some very useful features as we plow through the fields of our game dev work. Okay, so at least in Europe, the history of gardening is deeply entangled with colonialism, right? The mission to civilize the world, the mission to appropriate territory, often portrayed as a scantily clad woman lounging out in nature, readily available to be grabbed by the white man, suggestively planting a flag, right? In all of this, botany played an important part, since the uprooting and collecting of exotic plants by Europe's imperial centers expressed symbolic dominance over the native region of the stolen plant, right? So this is now my land. So let's zoom in a bit further and see how features of colonial botany can be mapped to game design and the games industry. Mind that this is only one of many possible angles on game dev. So rather than fully enlightening us about the meaning of game design, right? I expect it to just spark some thoughts and make us better game devs. So where to start? Let's start with etymology, the history of the term gardening. The Frankish root gardo basically means fenced in, enclosure, something that is closed off from the world. This means that in order for something to be a garden, it must be shut off from the world out there. In this enclosure, we make something grow, and in the case of the European past, this something is an empire driven by a capitalist motivation, right? So we can say that the colonial garden is a micro version of the empire. The hows, whats, and whys of gardening can tell us a lot about power struggles. So struggles of what can count as cultivated, who dominates the world, and who owns the right to look, name, and act around things in it. So let's imagine something for a moment. Imagine that the botanical empire is the games industry. Both are systems driven by capitalist motivations, both use the latest technology to expand and breed desirable consumer objects, like chocolate, coffee, Assassin's Creed, you name it, right? So here's how I'm going to compare these systems. First, I will talk about 3 botanical practices: collecting, naming, and pruning, and how they might map to game development. Secondly, I will look at agents of empire. Who are the workers, and where might be parallels with game work right now? And thirdly, now these 2 parts will mainly draw on the dysfunction of the games industry, right? So in the third part, I'll talk about threats of colonial game gardening and how we might embrace these threats to decolonize game development. It's a rather nice task. So, collecting. At the core of colonial botany has been the mission to send out botanical explorers into the so-called New World and bring exotic, unknown plants back home to the imperial center. So strolling around in native land, discovering plants which no European, which means to the Europeans no human, has ever seen before, right? So the idea was to pick and thereby own nature before the French did, right? That's kind of the process. So there was some grand relishing in the idea that one could just stroll through native land, collect a bunch of botanical souvenirs, and thereby own that place. And this was considered a sign of superiority and innovation. Yeah? So there was a sense of naturalism. That's my best shot at a pun combining nature and nationalism. Thanks for laughing. So by collecting and owning plants, the nation symbolically owned the land it was stolen from. That was possible because no credits were given to those who already knew and had developed intricate understandings of their local plants. So a plant was only worth something if collected and put into the inventory of the empire. Then it counted. Then it was like, this is now a plant. Like colonial explorers, game developers liked themselves in the roles of innovators, venturing out into the seemingly uncharted world of folk games and appropriating gameplay principles, right? A world where no one owns mechanics can be sold as innovation. So one example is the mechanic of rock, paper, scissors. So this mechanic traveled from Asia to the West as late as in the 20th century. Before that, the mechanics existed as the so-called Sansokumi Ken games, with Mushi Ken as one of the earliest versions dating back to 1809. So from left to right in the image here, you see the slug, the frog, which you might like. I heard frogs are popular here, and the snake. And video game designers picked a similar balancing system for games like StarCraft. Only now they sell it as innovative digital culture owned by a certain production empire, whose name I forgot, sorry. So let's move on into in-game dynamics. Games also promote the pleasure of invading strange places and picking up unknown items, which are then turned into property or currency. So when it comes to plants, for instance, in games, many games insist that a plant is only worth something if you can interact with it by ripping it from the ground and turning it into something more useful, right? So one example comes from Fallout 4, where plants can be turned into food or money. Actually, what you can do as a player of Fallout 4 is to go visit your neighbor's garden, harvest their crops in front of their eyes, and then offer to sell them to them. Yeah? Not only will they pay handsomely for this, they will also thank you for your service. A little dialogue window. So they never really owned the gardens in the first place. You did. You owned the garden. In fact, when you own a plantation yourself in Fallout 4, you also own everyone who happens to join you on that plantation. So you command them around, you become a plantation overseer. More of that later, but I want you to remember the outlines here. The crops have the same outline as the person that you have on your field here, in your garden. So, moving on to the next example. Minecraft, everyone's darling. I will destroy it now. As suggested, in the name, everything in Minecraft is mine, right? It's not your craft, it's Minecraft. Including the flowers, of course. And as mentioned, flowers only become useful by being turned into something else, like soup, like colors, both of which can be traded with villagers, and can be also bred for players' enjoyment. So, speaking of villagers, several tutorials on YouTube exist that teach gamers of Minecraft how to successfully breed villagers and lock them into tiny trade cells for maximum efficiency. So, a popular approach is to squeeze villagers inside a one-by-one enclosure where they are stuck to trade items, like leather, emeralds, rotten flesh, whatever they have, until the player decides they are no longer needed. What happens next? So some YouTuber architects of these trading camps swear on storage boxes which contain the items you need to trade with this particular villager. And in case the villager doesn't yield the wanted result, efficient levers can be pulled to drop them into a lava stream, where beneath the building. It's very handy. So a new spot becomes available for the next villager who has already conveniently been bred next door inside a breeding prison. Right? So, and Minecraft's water physics help transport the villagers from their cradles to their terminal appointments. This is procedural slavery. So, in this context, the popularity of Minecraft as innovative teaching tool gains an odd note, right? Why is Minecraft so frequently promoted as a learning tool without a content warning for procedural slavery? If anything, I think that Minecraft would suit itself to teach kids about the history of Western entitlement in a world where other cultures are completely objectified, which is history, right? The villagers do not speak, or do they? But this would be a great opportunity to teach the work of Gayatri Spivak, a post-colonial scholar who in 1988 already asked the question under which conditions people in colonized countries can have a voice at all. So I think it would be a great opportunity to combine these two things. Moving on to the next segment, naming. So, botany was not only about finding plants in the wild, it was also about naming these plants, even before colonial times. So even before that, Europeans were obsessed with naming, as shown in the ritual of baptism. After a baby is born by a mother during an intense process of labor, baptism comes in to claim the real birth of the kid by making it part of the Christian community. So this happens through a holy cosplay ritual conducted by men baptizing the child in the name of the father, as observed in Anne McClintock's book, Imperial Leather, which I highly recommend. So let's say the mother thing didn't happen. It's the midwife priest men who carry out the real initiation of the child by spraying it with holy water from an artificial womb pool thingy, right? So in German, which is my mother tongue, as you might have noticed, this has a special twist because the pool is actually the same word, it's called Becken, which also ironically means pelvis. So one thing in this cosplay naming festival is also that the male midwife priest casts some holy spells. So spells which only an elite could understand because Latin. Right? So botany really learns from this, and they also use Latin spells, But this time we have moved from the religious superstition to some rational science guys naming all the things. Right? I forgot the name of the person to the left, but the right dude, I think you might recognize here in Sweden. I see some nods. That's Carl Linné, who was actually a professor at Uppsala University in the 1700s. And he came up with a naming system that was supposed to work for all plants of all times in all regions. And this, someone might remember the name of this system. It's called binomial nomenclature, which is fancy in its own right, but it basically means each plant was baptized with a first Latin name and a small surname, like Carl Linné himself. Kind of easily understandable. And somehow Linné's system went absolutely viral because it came with some features which were really good for the empire. So here are 3 of these features. First, it set up the world for classification, the whole world, which means whatever was named existed. Right? A plant from now on only existed if it had been classified according to the rational science boy scheme. Right? Anything that didn't meet this classification could be easily dismissed, including locally available knowledge that did not match the classification scheme. Right? So secondly, coming up with a fancy genus and a species name was a sneaky name to make some qualitative judgments about that plant. Right? So yes, if something was poorly understood or considered useless or toxic or ugly, that was just encrypted in the Latin name. Right? But also, if Linné liked someone, he named a nice plant after that person, like with his student Per Kalm and his business partner Gautier. They have a lot of plants named after them. So naming was a way of branding and trademarking, right? Naming plants, showing off to the scientific community that you're going places. Thirdly, classification made sure that white male European knowledge was perceived as the only knowledge there was. So if a man from Europe didn't name a plant, it didn't exist. Right? So according to this self-fulfilling troll logic, this was evidence, taken as evidence that white men were in fact the only civilized people out there, keeping the wisdom to civilize them all. So what are examples of this kind of behavior are in game development culture? Here are some preliminary suggestions, not complete. First, the impulse to label all the things is expressed through game genre labels all over the place and tags. So currently everything that's out there on the market as a game can be classified into a genre or subgenre, or it's not a game. Right? Have you ever heard that your game is not a game? That's what happens when you don't have a label. So for some reason we're still very much enamored with these labeling systems. But this isn't limited to the market, because I noticed that in academia too, folks are obsessed with defining games, play, gamefulness. What's that? You need a definition for that. Filling books, and all based on good intentions. But guys trying to capture gameness in a single definition is a bit like studying butterflies by pinning them down on a corkboard. I mean, you captured it, but it's dead now. Secondly, there are some labels which are only grudgingly accepted and which make a difference between good games and bad games. Think of the walking simulator, for instance. So the walking simulator started out as a way to delegitimize games, like useless games, like Dear Esther and Gone Home, which resonated with a lot of players, but which according to some gamers shouldn't be regarded as a game. Since then, walking simulators have found their way into common usage, indicating now a new genre. However, this word still comes with negative connotations and is, by the way, unnecessarily ableist. Why is it called walking simulator if we could more inclusively call it floating or traveling simulator? So, thirdly, in game development, fancy terminology creates knowledge ghettos and toxic exclusion around who is allowed to like games, right? So, who is invited into voice chats and whose stories and expertise is listened to. In a recent ethnographic study to the left, Kishonna Gray has found that black gamers are excluded from the Xbox universe based on the racial profiling of their voice. And at this year's GDC, Bonnie Ruberg talked about harassment, so the harassment of games educators, and how game educators potentially face it when talking about games for everyone, stating facts like video games have always been queer, because they have always been played by queer people. So exclusive practices of labeling actively harm marginalized groups, and silencing them in order to propagate the problematic idea that games can be captured in a single definition owned by white male game researchers, whose name I also forgot, sorry. Moving on next, pruning. So pruning is a horticultural term that refers to cutting and trimming, but historically it's also very much connected to the idea that leaving plant in its natural state is unnatural, right? So the nature should accommodate my idea of nature and should accommodate a civilization, a civilized version of the plant, right? So to cut nature is to cultivate nature, make it live up to the imperial standards of a certain park or certain culture, and make it civilized. But this requires a constant regime of maintenance, a constant ritual of cutting back, watering, putting into form, and so on. So, for example, colonial botany is obsessed with hedges and lawns. It's one of the things. It's one thing to plant a lawn, but maintaining a lawn is an altogether different ballpark. So next to fertilizers and lots of water, one also needs the right hardware for the job. Trimmers, mowers, and even then there might be weeds sprouting at the edge. So pruning is an expensive activity, but according to colonial logic, it's needed, paradoxically, to keep nature in a natural state. Otherwise, it will be barbaric. So in short, botanical gardens are supposed to be more natural than nature itself. This is also what suits them so well for being enrolled with affects of romance and romantic love, right? Like the bushes out there that require constant trimming and paranoid tending and adjustment, so does the bond between the heterosexual monogamous couple kissing in the perfectly trimmed rose gardens. Right? So you do kind of the same ritual. But botanical gardens are not only for romantic couples, they are also hailed to kids as sites for learning. So providing them with neat labels to learn the names that some men have given to those plants. Let's take that back to video games. Like colonial botanists, video games are obsessed with producing nature more beautiful and real than reality itself, reaching a state of perfection. This can be seen in the quest for hyperrealism and the creation of real-time reflection and L systems and believable AI, right? To throw out some expensive processes here. So like in botany, this requires a range of expensive tools, specialized skills, processing power, and we tend to glorify those. Nothing seems more, nothing seems out of reach when it comes to creating digital video game gardens, just in the hopes that some players will enjoy walking in them. So like in the watering of botanical gardens, a lot of money is being drowned every day to make these players feel feelings. Moving on to the agents of empire. So it's clear by now that there's a lot of work that's being put into gardening during the colonial time. So the next question is, who's doing that work? And I'm afraid the answer to these questions, to this question also matters to understand video game culture right now. So basically the story of work in colonial gardening is the story of two places, the center and the periphery. We've already casually looked at these places. So the center is the home of these science boys here. The European, quote-unquote, civilized capitals where knowledge work is made. So here you see a typical gathering of Louis XIV in France and members of the Academy of Science. And you can already guess that knowledge work is kind of expensive because basically these science parties don't pay for themselves. And when you look closely, you can see a lot of expensive hardware. So we see some maps, some contraptions over there, some vessels. And we see the most important thing, we see this. It's not just a guy hanging out in the back looking metal, but this is actually the tool for medical science, right? So imagine, like back then, most science lovers were super into the theory that Europeans were superior. And how could they tell? Yeah, with the help of bones, like on skulls. They even had a fancy name for that. It's called craniometry. Who has heard of that? Wow. Okay. Preaching to the choir here. The craniometry is basically a science that kind of hit the colonies because it explained why the bad skull people had to be slaves. Like there was good skull people and bad skull people, and the skulls of these people in the periphery were simply closer to the animal kingdom, and so the good skull people had to subdue them. And this wasn't just science, it was science plus, because it was also backed up by God. The words from the Bible, Genesis 1, verse 28. Subdue whatever you find that is subduable. I'm just freely referencing, don't nail me down on this. So, knowledge in the center, here, knowledge, and slavery in the periphery, that's kind of the labor distribution. And this is also how the periphery was branded as cheap, right? So back in the day, it was super scientific and also godly to plant sugar, coffee, and cotton on slave plantations, and there were laws backing it up as well. So who of you learned about the Barbados slave code from 1661 in school? See? One hand? Two hands? 1.5? Okay. Yeah, me neither. But this code defined the slave basically as a plantation inventory. A bit like we have seen in Fallout 4 before with the outlines, where the outlines of the farm continue around the worker. Right? So this human being, the unpaid worker, she or he is under the surveillance by an overseer as well. So that's the only dude here wearing a tuxedo at 35 degrees Celsius. And so yeah, luckily some things have changed. For instance, we know now that skull science is not a thing. And we know that there's only one race, the human race, and that we're different but we're equal, right? And there's some things which are still to be fixed. All these dysfunctional dynamics between center and periphery have left deep wounds. I want to quote Toni Morrison here, who puts it in an interview with cultural scholar Paul Gilroy. Slavery broke the world in half, broke it every way. It broke Europe. It made them into something else. It made them slave masters. It made them crazy. Back to games. Lately, we keep hearing disheartening stories about working conditions in the games industry. Horrendous job insecurity, living in constant fear of being laid off after their next project, crunch culture, harassment. Slowly, unions are forming to fight capitalist bosses and improve workers' conditions. But these are tales from some of the centers of game production, from Europe, from North America. The peripheries of hardware production are elsewhere. China, Taiwan, Singapore, Mexico, Malaysia, to just name a few. So in huge high-tech plantations, low-wage, unskilled workers assemble video game parts in what can only be called a lifelong crunch, right? They still rarely have the economic means to enjoy these games. So Phone Story is a game for iPhones, now banned from the App Store, which comments on some of these pretty dim labor conditions of global hardware production. First, we make kids mine cobalt in the Republic of Congo. Then we catch suicidal Foxconn workers in Zhejiang, China, with a suicide prevention net. And finally, we disassemble highly toxic electronic waste on one of the dumping grounds in the global south. That could be Ghana, Pakistan, China, right? So, yet when I think about Game Workers Unite, what I'm thinking about is my edgy game friends who struggle to make their edgy game a success in Europe, North America, Japan, and how they will be able to survive with that. Why am I not thinking of my Chinese friends who work unpaid overtime at Foxconn to earn a total of $550 a month? When I think of hardware design, I think of alternative controllers and how I might use them to express myself. But why am I not thinking about my friends in Brazil who live next to an electronic waste dump? One answer is that I still live in a world divided into center and periphery. I also live in a world that has taught me that I'm an individual, not a part of a system. And where I stand as an individual, game labor is all about expression, entrepreneurship, fun, not about survival, really, when it comes down to it. And this is delusional and ironic, because, again, as game designers, we're interested in systems. So we need to start seeing the systems that are there. You're into systems? Fuck individualism and stand up for others. These systems oppress our friends every day as center versus periphery. So, the divide is not only geographical, as we have heard, and I will repeat this, it has come up a lot of times, it's also gendered. So, a 2011 study by the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, showed that 73% of women in the industry work outside the main jobs of developing games, which means that they have little to say in the creative choices. And I want to draw your attention to this boring table here. I've made it boring, especially the last row, this one. So 95% of the most prestigious, well-paid jobs, the programming jobs, are taken by men. But I mean, this will certainly change as more women and queer folks enter the games industry, right? So, it sounds good. And according to a recent study on the job satisfaction of game development students by HEFGA, LGBT folks and women who have studied game development are as likely as males to find a job in the industry after completing their degrees. But they also are way more likely to get fed up with the industry, leaving it after an average of 2 years. This means that the prestigious creative jobs continue to be held by white straight men in the imperialist capitalist center, branding games as boys' toys. This is ironic, given that the very hands which have assembled any console, joystick, touchscreen, and VR set, which allow these men to have creative ideas in the first place, are the hands of underpaid women of color in Brazil and Pakistan. So, bottom line, the roots of colonial dysfunctions are deep. They reach into the now, they shape the systems that are in place today. Caring about systems then means that it should set off our alarm bells when we hear slogans which try to brand video games as somehow more superior to other industries, that we are somehow on the highest ladder of cultural expression because tech, that video games are the force that changes the world. Paradoxically, these are slogans that come from those least interested in change. These are the garden owners. These are the people who drink as much tea as they like in their walled-off property and paying as little as possible. Perhaps wearing a top hat or a tuxedo, I don't know. So, moving on to threats. It's kind of time to break down these walls and disturb the tea tris party. Because, thanks for laughing, because there are and always have been threats to the empire. No matter how much we prune it, weeds will grow at the edge of the perfectly maintained lawn, and the weeds are persistent. And if let alone, they will create biodiversity. Speaking of biodiversity, diversity, in fact, is the worst enemy of the colonial game gardening. And this is nowhere more pronounced, more clearly than in the term "Indipocalypse," a term dreamed up by the overseers of video game plantations, like the people who blame the increasing numbers of small game makers for the fact that video games are not exponentially profitable. In the good old times, pre-diversity, so to speak, they say, you could make a platformer with a twist and be set forever. Right? But yes, the immense return that indie games like Braid and Fez, Super Meat Boys and so on, have made cannot no longer be easily replicated. That's true. But in a kind of fun world, such profits shouldn't have been possible in the first place. The Indipocalypse is, in fact, a healthy thing. It opens a dysfunctional industry to small makers. It's wrong to frame that as bad weeds, which need to be eliminated from the closely controlled, already good garden enclosure of video games. But there are other ways of talking about diversity, biodiversity in game design. What if we change the discourse from gardening to living with the land? There are local knowledges about nature which do not neatly fit into gardening models, which can be an opportunity to challenge exclusionary supremacist ways of making games. In Sami culture, the Northern Europe's indigenous people, there is a concept of kuksa. Who knows that? A couple of hands. So for those who haven't heard that term, kuksa is a mug which is carved out of birch wood. But what is special is that only thick tree parts are used for carving kuksa. You see them to the left. So kuksas are basically made from tree cancers, from outgrowths. They could never be used for anything in industrial production. So instead of using any wood and forcing it into a desired shape, kuksa are carved based on what is made available by the abundance of nature. Even especially a thick tree can give this particular wood, which is required for the most sustainable ways of making these mugs. I'm not trying, by the way, here to promote stealing indigenous traditions, but rather learning from this approach to see what grows where you live. There are alternative ways of looking at an ailing, increasingly unstable games industry. What instead of in the apocalypse, we started referring to the increasing numbers of small, diverse makers as vernacular botanists. So, in botany, vernacular means unofficial, local ways of describing plants. Such botanists live with the land and develop knowledges that don't match the criteria of an external system. My own style, for instance, is more in the ballpark of trash gardening, as you can see in this picture. I like to take trash things and turn them into plants. That also refers to how I make games. But you might find something else more appropriate. Here are some other vernacular botanists that I admire very much. Cook Your Way, the first game to the upper left, is a physical installation, a cooking station in which players literally process the story of an immigrant trying to make sense of all the red tape they are faced in a new, strange country through the medium of cooking. Ritual of the Moon is a 28-day-long narrative-driven game about power, loneliness, and healing. The game is a daily meditation activity composed of a memory game, drawing symbols, receiving a mantra, and making decisions about the future of the Earth. Space Bubble Cat is an interactive fiction game in the absolutely fantastic Bitsy editor. We help a lonely cat float through comic panels and help them find friends and learn about boundaries. Robot Slow Dance is exactly what it sounds like. Two tiny blocky robots which are moved within a playful installation to learn the art of physical intimacy. The Crying Game is another Bitsy game in which we play as tears rolling down the game's face. Each tear tells the story of its origin. So, here's what these creators do to practice vernacular botany, I would suggest. Instead of roaming strange lands and collecting what seems exotic and therefore prestigious or innovative, vernacular botanists develop a deep relationship with the land on which they currently live, so to speak, and listen to its complex contextual needs. Instead of describing the land through binary nomenclature, feature lists as it were, vernacular botanists dare to tell complex stories and rich anecdotes. Vernacular botanists know that nature is flexible, and they honor this reality instead of trying to capture their games through a simplistic label. Instead of trimming and cutting ideas, there is a curiosity of how they will unfold and grow and where they need support. They stop policing an artificial boundary between the lawn and the weeds, the good and the bad practice through high-tech hardware, software. Instead of becoming forced into beauty, the land becomes what it can be. It becomes wild, it becomes us. Let's grow wild. Thank you. So I'm ready to take some questions. If you have a comment rather than a question, please find the question in your comment.
So just come up to the mic and ask questions.
Okay, maybe I can go first. Thank you for a very inspiring and amazing talk. First, I want to say amen, I guess. Second, what do you have suggestions in terms of sort of more immediate or more practical strategies maybe for widening this movement that is now, it is happening inside the games industry, like in the walls of being employed, but not so much outside. So already, for example, player creators, modders, all these sort of people who are, lots of indie people are left out of that. What would be like more practical ways of maybe taking that step?
Sorry, I didn't really understand that question.
Okay, like how would you suggest that we do this growing wild, right? Being the first weed when the person who maintains the garden and that has like a spinning blade to cut you down is quite scary. And if there's enough weeds, the machine will break. But how do we get to that point?
Right. So I would see that as it is scary, I agree, to be kind of the first one to break into something. The wonderful thing, though, is that we aren't the first, and there's already a big group of makers, communities, that just need your support, maybe. If you don't know where to start, find others who are already doing that work of building countercultures. And there's a long tradition, actually, of doing that, or also within games. So I would say the first step to do that is find your community and see what is already done, and then you can also source out what is accessible to you. So I think that one of the dangers of contributing to a counterculture is to be scared that your contribution isn't good enough because it isn't big enough, and that you have to do everything yourself. But actually, all of us have different resources, different places in this system, different aspects that have more access to resources or are more oppressed by the system, and it's actually our job to find out where are we in the system and what resources can we access to contribute to this already existing movement.
Thank you.
Hi Sabine, nice to see you again. We usually think alike, but we take different paths in the garden to reach the same goal. So bear with me now. I play games like Proteus and other games that are called walking simulators now. And I hated the discussion in the beginning because they were called non-games, and I always hated that. But you're talking about labeling as a bad thing. And for me, usually labeling is a good thing for communication and actually building bridges and actually, make people come together and can talk about the same thing to create a common goal. So I'm curious to why you're talking about it like a bad thing, even though you're referring it to colonialism, of course. But you can also use that power, that common alphabet, to create good things and to invite people to strive to the same target through the garden.
Right. Thank you for that question. I think it's an excellent contribution, actually, to the perspective that I was trying to foster, because it is a very a good point that systems of power and the way how labels have been used can be taken up for the sake of resistance, right? So what I'm talking about is more the ownership of labels by someone who is ruling within that system. But actually, it can be a constructive way. And I've quoted Gayatri Spivak before, just mentioned her. And she actually coined a term called strategic essentialism, which basically is a survival strategy or a resistance strategy, picking out terms that are maybe not perfect, but they can work towards creating a resistance or creating alternative culture, right? To alternative definitions, if you want to. What I'm criticizing, though, is the simplicity of labels, that we can create communities around shared ideas, but labels will always exclude some aspects of the complexity that's going on. That said, of course, I'm very much in favor of using whatever we can get to create community. So it is a quite complex answer. Maybe it's not satisfactory to it's not a solution, really. It's more like a struggle. Should we take up labels or not if we take them up for different purposes? And this is an ongoing struggle, so thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a brilliant talk, Sabine. So I work in the board game industry, which is a much worse place for colonialism. Basically, all the mechanics and everything we do are based on colonialism. Worker placement is just basically putting slaves on your plantations. And there's a lot of issues with board game mechanics. And I just want to know if, as someone who works in that medium, where should I start? Because there is no starting point. Every game mechanic in that industry is kind of based on colonialist gardening.
Right. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I feel you. I would say, so it's especially hard, building on your point, to disrupt the system that is so ingrained as normal, where we have especially German board games, which are based on simulating wars most of the time, and the value of competition. I think it's really difficult to dismantle something that's not even seen as problematic. So I would recommend, I think, that's how I would start, to go to other places wherever you can find influences of finding new mechanics for your board game design. Where else can you go? If board games themselves are not a good resource to decolonize mechanics, where else can you go? Because you're already on the way somewhere, but where is that, and where do you stand? Do you have other reference points that you might dig up that might help you design a different system?
Thanks. I don't really have an answer to that. It's just the entire board game industry is kind of just what you talked about. So it's
Right.
kind of a weird situation where like the innovators are kind of the mind and they are doing mind stuff, but it's still.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, where I start is maybe subverting what is there in connection with finding new themes. Like, what are themes that are basically counter to that? And then how can you subvert existing mechanics? There are board game references that are not about colonialism, or I don't know whether it is colonialism. The pandemic series, for instance, we can have a conversation about whether that is colonial or not, but it is, in any case, it is cooperative, which is very rare in board games, that you have cooperative mechanics. But looking at games that are cooperative could be a way of maybe finding something.
Thank you.
Hello. So, as someone who doesn't really see many of these problems that you bring up as huge problems and doesn't really think about them when they design games, what is one thing that's concretely you would like me to do differently when I design games?
So this is a tricky one, because there's no universal answer to this. And I lied a bit, of course, we're also individuals. We are in a system, but only you can know where you stand in it as yourself, and where you have leverage, and where you have access. What resources do you have access to? So the first step I would ask you to is to look, where can you contribute? What would be a valid, not valid, but viable way for you to take a first step? And I think asking this question that you just did is already going there. But I can't find answers for you, because I simply don't know anything about your context, right? So it's about reflecting the context, and then perhaps talking to people who are doing that work and finding out more about your context and how this might be, fruitfully used.
Thank you.
I don't have any more to say about that, sorry.
So do we have any more questions? No? Okay, then thank you.
Thanks.